Welcome back to Haunted Graves After Dark, where the dead aren't silent. They're just waiting for the right night to speak. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, because every place carries its own shadows. Some older, some hungrier. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is coincidental. What follows is a tale of lingering obsessions, forgotten sins, and an unearthed truth that time itself kept, trying and failing to bury. The graveyard at Bonus was never meant to hold stories, only bodies. It stretched behind the old psychiatric hospital like an afterthought, a patch of land where Prague's cold winds whispered through dead grass and tilted crosses. By 1929, few people visited it at night, and those who did rarely returned with the same calm they entered with. The locals spoke of strange lights, of murmuring voices beneath the soil, of soft knocks coming from headstones that should have stayed silent. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, but not Inspector Victor Havliek. He had spent his life chasing what others called unbelievable, and this time, the unbelievable had arrived at his door. It began with a call from the night caretaker, a thin, gray-bearded man named Merrick, who had worked the grounds for nearly 40 years. His voice trembled as he reported what he had seen. A grave unmarked, isolated, half-sunken had opened itself under the full winter moon. There were no footprints, no tools, no sign of disturbance around it, just a clean, perfect split-in. The earth, like something beneath, had pushed up and parted the soil with careful hands. When Victor arrived, Merrick was standing by the cemetery gate, holding a lantern that wouldn't stop flickering. "Inspector," he said, eyes darting toward the trees, "do not step inside until you've heard me." But Victor brushed past him. He had seen corpses pulled from rivers, bodies crushed in machinery, scenes that hardened him long ago. Hey? Hole in the ground didn't frighten him yet. The moon hung low above the bare branches as he approached the grave. The air felt wrong, thicker somehow, as if he were walking underwater. The open grave lay at the far corner, at the very edge of the cemetery where the wind never seemed to reach. Victor knelt beside it, brushing soil from the wooden planks below. The coffin beneath had been split down the center, not shattered. Not damaged, cut, almost surgically, as if it had been peeled open from the inside. "Who was buried here?" Victor asked. Merrick shook his head. "No record. We found the grave already here when I started. Old caretakers said it belonged to a foreigner. Unclaimed. No family. No stone." Victor frowned. Prague kept records meticulously, especially after the war. Yet this grave was not indexed anywhere. That troubled him more than the broken coffin. He leaned closer, shining his light into the darkness below. The coffin was empty. What happened to the body? Merrick swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I heard something last night. I thought it was the wind, until it whispered my name." Victor straightened. "That's why you called me?" he asked. "That?" Merrick whispered. "And this?" He handed the inspector a folded scrap of cloth. When Victor opened it, he saw a small brass emblem, tarnished with age, but unmistakably military. A circular medallion engraved with an eagle holding 3 arrows. "Where did you find this?" Victor asked. "By the grave," Marek said. "It wasn't there yesterday?" Victor turned it in his gloved fingers. He had seen this insignia before in a case involving secret paramilitary groups that operated in the collapsing days of the Empire. Men who vanished without records. Men who were buried in unmarked graves. But why would one rise? As Victor examined the soil again, something caught his eye. thin scratches along the inside of the grave's wooden frame. Not random, not panicked. Patterns, lines that intersected like coded markings. Someone inside had carved them deliberately. He traced them with his fingertip, feeling the grooves. They formed shapes he recognized from old report symbols used by deserters who claimed to have been part of forbidden experiments. Experiments that were supposed to have ended years ago. A cold wind drifted through the cemetery then, but the trees did not sway. The lanterns did not flicker. Only the grave seemed to breathe, the soil settling with a faint sigh. "We should close it," Marek whispered anxiously. "Fill it? Seal it?" "No," Victor said. "Not yet." He stood and looked over the cemetery. Something was missing from the scene, something so obvious it gnawed at him. Then he realized there were no animal tracks, no birds, no insects. Even the stray cats that roamed Prague's graveyards had vanished. The entire place felt abandoned except for the grave. "What did you hear besides your name?" Victor asked. Marek hesitated, his eyes shifting toward the far wall, where the shadows deepened unnaturally. A voice, low, calm, it said, "Not yet." Then it stopped, and the grave opened. Victor scanned the ground again. If the body had left the coffin, there would be signs, soil, displacement, movement trails, dragged footprints. But there was nothing. It was as if the occupant had simply evaporated, or stepped out without touching the earth. Inspector Marek whispered, his voice barely audible now. "I think he's still here." Victor turned sharply. "What makes you say that?" Marek pointed a trembling finger toward the nearest row of gravestones. Victor followed his gaze. One stone had fresh fingerprints on it, long, narrow, slightly distorted, as if the fingers were stiff or fractured. They were pressed into the frost like someone had stood there moments before. Victor approached cautiously. The prints were recent, very recent. "This isn't possible," he muttered. The air shifted. Behind him, a soft thud echoed from the darkness. He spun around, lantern raised. "Marek?" But Marek was no longer beside him, and the cemetery had grown silent again. Victor stood alone, staring into the moonlit rows of graves, each one still, each one watching no one, with a sinking certainty that whatever had climbed from that coffin was not done wandering, and it had taken Marek with it. Victor called Marek's name again, louder this time, but the sound seemed to die before it reached the far edges of the cemetery. The fog thickened between the gravestones, low and heavy, clinging to the ground like it was trying to smother anything that moved. He stepped forward carefully, scanning for footprints, drag marks, anything that would show where Marek had gone. But the frost remained pristine, untouched, as if the caretaker had simply been erased from existence. Rather than taken, his lantern cast long, shaking shadows over the graves as he crouched near the stone where the distorted fingerprints still glistened. They hadn't faded. If anything, they looked fresher, like the frost was reforming around them. Victor reached out a gloved hand and hovered over the marks. They were cold, far colder than the air. He felt a faint tremor pass through him, a sensation like someone had exhaled against his ear. He stood up fast and turned. Nothing, just the silent rows of the dead. A sudden clang rang out from the far corner of the cemetery, the metal gate leading toward the old hospital. Victor sprinted toward the sound, boots crunching against frozen ground. The gate was slightly ajar, swaying gently even though there was no wind. Beyond it lay the narrow path that led between the trees and toward the abandoned east wing of Bonna's psychiatric hospital. Marek would never have gone that way willingly. Everyone in Prague knew the stories about that wing. It had been shut down after a fire 20 years earlier, a fire that supposedly killed 3 patients and a doctor, who had been rumored to conduct unapproved experiments. Rumors Victor had never fully dismissed. He pushed through the gate and followed the path. The lantern light flickered, then stabilized. The frost-covered leaves along the ground showed no prints ahead of him, yet he felt movement. Not footsteps, not breaths. Something else. A presence. Watching Dot when he reached the hospital's east wing, he hesitated. The building loomed like a dark skeleton, its broken windows reflecting moonlight like empty eyes. The fire damage was still visible on the eastern wall, long black streaks like charred claw marks. The front door hung crookedly, barely attached by its hinges. Victor gripped the lantern tighter and entered Dot inside. The air was colder, bitter. Each breath he took felt like inhaling ice. His boots echoed down the long, hollow corridor lined with rusted gurneys and peeling paint. A faint dripping sound echoed somewhere deep within, rhythmic and unsettling. He called out for Merrick again, but only the dripping answered him. Halfway down the corridor, he noticed something. A thin trail of frost on the floor, snaking along the tiles in an unnatural pattern, like a frozen vein leading deeper into the building. It pulsed faintly in the lantern light, as if reacting to his presence. He followed it. The trail led him into what had once been a patient examination room. Now it was barren, just cracked tiles, a toppled table, and a single rusted lamp hanging by a wire. But Victor froze when he saw what lay on the floor near the far wall. Merrick's hat. He rushed over, picking it up. The fabric was damp, almost icy. "Merrick?" he shouted, the sound echoing off the walls. A whisper slipped through the room. "Not yet." Victor's blood turned to ice. The whisper wasn't human, not entirely. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He spun around, lantern raised high. "Show yourself," he demanded. The shadows trembled. Then, slowly, something stepped forward, not from a doorway, not from behind an object, but from the shadows themselves, as if peeling free from the darkness. The figure was tall, gaunt, its limbs stiff, its posture wrong. Its clothing was old. Military uniform, torn and discolored. Frost clung to its sleeves, its collar, its chest. But its face. Victor's breath caught. The skin was pale, stretched too tightly over the skull. The eyes were sunken hollows, not empty, but filled with a strange gray shimmer, like moonlight trapped in water. The jaw hung slightly crooked, as though broken long ago and never set right. In its hand it held something Marek's lantern, still lit. The flame inside shivered, blue instead of orange. "Marek," Victor whispered. The creature turned its head slowly, mechanically, and looked directly at him. It did not blink, did not breathe. "Who are you?" Victor asked. Voice steady, despite the pounding in his chest. The creature lifted its free hand and tapped 2 fingers against its own chest, exactly where a soldier's identification badge would have been. Then it took a step forward. "Victor?" Stepped back. "You climbed out of that grave," Victor continued. "Why? What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, in a sound like wind moving through stone, it murmured, "Kalan needed." The word rattled in the room, vibrating through the air. Victor swallowed. Needed for what? The creature didn't answer. Instead, it crouched suddenly too quickly for something dead and pressed its hand against the floor. The frost trail pulsed brighter, spreading outward like cracks forming in ice. Victor stepped back, just as the creature stood upright again. Then it pointed toward the hallway. A direction, a warning, or a command. Before Victor could respond, the creature flickered, literally flickered and vanished back into the shadows like a flame extinguished. Marek's lantern dropped to the floor and rolled to Victor's feet. Still burning that eerie blue dot, Victor knelt, lifting it. It was warm now. Too warm, as though someone's hand had been gripping it tightly only seconds earlier. The flame inside shifted from blue to orange again. He looked toward the hallway where the creature had pointed. A cold realization echoed in his mind. Whatever had risen from that grave did not simply wander. It had purpose, intention, and it wanted Victor to follow. Clutching both lanterns, Victor stepped out of the room and into the hallway. The frost trail had changed direction again, now leading deeper toward the old operating theater. He hesitated. Only for a moment. Then he began walking, the darkness swallowing him as he followed the trail that the dead had shown him, and he knew without question that Marek was still alive, but not for long. Victor walked deeper into the crumbling hospital, both lanterns swinging unevenly in his hands as he followed the widening trail of frost. The blue glow from Marek's lantern cast strange reflections across the peeling walls, making the building feel alive like it pulsed with its own breath. Each step echoed too loudly, as if the hallways listened. The cold thickened the further he went, a cold not born from winter but from something older, something buried as he neared the old operating theater. He felt the air tighten. The corridor narrowed, ceiling lowering just enough to make him duck. His shoulders brushed crumbling plaster. The frost beneath his boots grew thicker, crunching like broken glass, and then he heard it, a voice, soft, ragged, humming. The melody wavered, broken and wrong, something a mother might hum to a child but slowed into a hollow, wavering tune. Victor stopped breathing. The sound seeped through the walls, drifting like cold smoke. His heart hammered, but he forced himself to keep walking. The door to the operating theater stood ahead, heavy metal, half open. A streak of frost outlined its edges. Victor pushed it open slowly, and it groaned in protest. Inside, the room stretched wide and circular, with tiered balconies where students once watched surgeries. Most of the seating had collapsed long ago, leaving jagged wood and rusted metal jutting upward like broken ribs. In the center of the room stood the old operating table tilt, its surface stained dark from decades of dust and rot. But the room was not empty. Marek hung suspended above the table. Bound by nothing, Victor could see his body lifted a foot off the ground as though held up by invisible wires. His head sagged forward, chin resting limply against his chest. His breath fogged the air in slow, trembling bursts. Marek! Victor's shout cracked through the silence. Marek's fingers twitched. Victor dropped the blue lantern and sprinted forward, reaching up to grab Marek's arm. As soon as he touched him, a shock like ice shot through his hand. He recoiled instantly, hissing from the cold. Marek's skin felt frozen solid, as if death had already taken him. But Marek's lips moved. Go back. The whisper was barely there, a thin thread of sound. I'm not leaving you, Victor said, forcing himself closer again. Who did this to you? What did that thing want? Marek's eyelids fluttered. Not what. Who? The word drifted into silence. A faint crack spread across the ceiling, followed by another. Frost spiraled outward like veins, reaching toward the center of the room. Victor stepped back, gripping his lantern tightly, sweeping it upward. The frost thickened rapidly, crawling along the rafters, spreading across the cracked glass of the overhead lights. Then he heard that humming again. Not coming from Merrick. From behind him, slowly Victor turned. A figure stood at the edge of the room, half slumped, half standing, its posture stiff and unnatural. The same gaunt soldier he'd seen in the corridor. Face tight with that unnatural stretch of skin, eyes hollow and shimmering. But something was different now. The figure was not alone. 3 more shapes pulled themselves from the shadows. All wore some form of uniform military coats, one's white medical jackets, torn armbands of the old psychiatric ward. Their limbs were too long, their movements too rigid. Frost bled from their feet as they stepped forward, gathering in a semicircle. Like an audience around the suspended caretaker. Victor felt his throat close. "What do you want from him?" he demanded. The soldier raised its head. Its jaw clicked as it moved. "Needed," the word was barely audible, carried through the air like a dying breath. "You keep saying that," Victor said. "Needed for what?" The soldier tapped its chest again, fingers brushing the place where its badge would have hung. A faint line of frost traced the shape of a rectangle and identification tag. Victor stepped closer, lantern held high. The badge wasn't there, but the outline of one was frozen into the uniform. A name had once been stitched beneath it, burned away by time and decay. Victor's breath caught. "You were a soldier in the Great War." The creature didn't move, but the air seemed to vibrate with a response. "Bonus took soldiers after the war," Victor muttered, mind racing. "Shell shock, trauma, nightmares. They brought you here. Experimented on you. You were one of the ones who died in the fire." The soldier's head twitched abruptly as if acknowledging him. The humming grew louder. Victor realized now it wasn't humming at all, it was murmuring. A crowd's murmur. Many voices layered together in broken syllables. "You're all from the fire," Victor whispered. "All the patients." The soldier stepped closer. Victor didn't retreat this time. He held his ground. "What do you need?" He pressed. The creature lifted an arm, pointing toward Marek. Its elbow cracked, a jagged snap like wood splitting. Marek's breath hitched. Frost coiled around his ankles, climbing slowly upward like vines. Victor lunged again, grabbing Marek's arm despite the cold that seared his skin. "You can't take him." The room trembled. The soldier's voice crawled up from the hollow of its throat. Replaced the meaning hit Victor harder than the cold ever could. "You want a body," he whispered. "Someone alive? Someone to take the place of whoever died here. Someone to finish what was started." The frost on Marek's body thickened, spreading toward his chest. His breaths grew sharper, weaker. "No," Victor said, voice breaking. "Not him." The soldier tilted its head. "You." The word wasn't spoken, it was pushed into Victor's mind like a memory forced underwater. He staggered backward, gripping the lantern to stay grounded. Marek groaned above him. The vines of frost crept higher. Victor dropped his lantern and grabbed Marek around the waist, pulling with all his strength. The invisible force holding him strained, resisting. For one moment the room felt like a frozen battlefield, silent except for the struggle. The breath of the dying, and the dead watching. And then something snapped. Marek fell into Victor's arms. Both men collapsed to the floor. The blue lantern guttered violently, flames stretching upward as if reacting to the sudden break. The murmuring voices surged. The soldier stepped forward, frost erupting from the ground beneath it. The other specters followed, shadows stretching across the floor like claws. Victor pulled Marek onto his feet, half dragging him. "Come on," he breathed, We're leaving. The creatures advanced. The frost spread faster. The entire room dimmed as the flame of the blue lantern trembled, flickered and then flared violently with a burst of bright, unnatural light. It stunned even the dead. Victor grabbed the lantern, yanked Marek upright, and staggered toward the door as the shadows recoiled from the sudden brightness. He didn't know how long the lantern's protection would last. He only knew one thing for certain. The dead weren't trying to scare them. They were trying to claim them. Victor dragged Marek through the door, stumbling into the narrow hallway as the sudden burst of blue light from the lantern flickered violently behind them. The flame sputtered like it was fighting the very air around it. Marek barely kept his footing, leaning heavily against Victor with every faltering step. His skin was cold enough to burn, and faint traces of frost were still creeping up his neck, dissolving only when the lantern swung close. The corridor stretched ahead in darkness. Victor's breath formed white clouds as he fought to keep his grip on both the lantern and Marek, behind them. The murmuring voices rose, layered whispers pulling at the edges of reality like fingers brushing a thin sheet of ice. The sound was getting closer. Stay awake, Victor whispered, shaking Marek's shoulder. Don't drift. They want you asleep. Marek's eyelids drooped. I can hear them. What are they saying? Marek swallowed hard, echoing. Names. Victor felt his skin crawl. Your name? No, Marek whispered. Yours? The voices dimmed suddenly, not disappearing but sinking like they were, withdrawing deeper into the walls. Victor didn't trust that silence. It felt intentional. I held breath before something worse. He pulled Marek faster. They turned a corner and entered a long hallway lined with rusted doors. Some still had numbers. Others had only carved initials, scratched violently into the paint. A few bore dark stains that time had never bothered to hide. The cold deepened. The lantern dimmed. Victor tightened his grip. The flame responded weakly, flickering back to life. Marek whispered, voice trembling. It doesn't want to work. It has to, Victor muttered. Marek's voice cracked. Why are they making you hear your name? Victor didn't answer. He already feared the truth. The dead weren't random. They had chosen him. He paused at a door marked 214-1. Of the few still upright on its hinges. A plaque hung crookedly above it, half rusted, the first letters eaten away by corrosion. But Victor could still read what remained. At reward fire victims -1,918 heat surged through his chest, burning away a piece of the cold. Victor had grown up hearing rumors about the fire, how the asylum had tried to cover up what happened, how soldiers and civilians alike were locked inside when the flames spread, how no bodies were ever returned to families because so many were burned beyond recognition. But he had never known it happened in this wing. He had never known it was this room. Marek tugged weakly at his sleeve. We need to keep going. But Victor pushed open the door. Inside lay rows of charred bed. Frames melted into twisted shapes. Blackened walls enclosed the room like a tomb. The ceiling had collapsed partially inward, leaving long beams dangling like skeletal limbs. Frost clung to everything, as if the fire's heat had been reversed, eternally frozen in place of flames. Victor stepped inside, breath trembling. Marek held onto the doorway, shivering violently. On the far wall was a cluster of names scratched desperately into the burned plaster. Dozens of them, overlapping, frantic, carved by hands that knew they were running out of time. One name stopped Victor cold. Victor Kobia, his blood turned to ice. He heard a sound behind him, a low, stretched breath. He turned slowly. The soldier stood inches away. Its hollow eyes glinted in the lantern light. Frost poured from its mouth as it leaned close. Not a coincidence. The words weren't spoken. They simply appeared in Victor's mind, pressed in like memories that weren't his. "You knew me?" Victor whispered. The soldier raised its head. "Slyly, we knew all of you." The other specters appeared along the edges of the room, crowding the doorway, filling the hall. Their limbs creaked like cracking ice. Their mouths moved but made no sound, as though they were whispering things only the dead could hear. Victor stepped back, lantern trembling in his grip. "My grandfather worked here," he said slowly, as memories began to surface. "He was a doctor in this ward during the war." The soldier tilted its face. Lepta. The words hit harder than any shout. "He tried to get the patients out," Victor insisted. "He helped evacuate a sharp." Crack split the air. The soldier's head jerked, the motion violent. Frost spiraled violently from its feet, spreading across the room in jagged patterns. Liar, the word echoed through Victor's skull like a hammer strike. Merrick stumbled into the room, breath hitching. "Victor, we have to run," before he could finish. The ceiling above them groaned. Snowy dust rained down. A beam shifted, grinding loudly. The entire room felt like it was leaning, like the building remembered the night it burned and was trying to reenact it. Victor grabbed Merrick's arm and pulled him out of the doorway. But something grabbed Victor's coat from behind. A hand, cold, iron-strong. The soldier had seized him, fingers digging into the fabric like claws. Frost spread across Victor's coat, reaching toward his skin. He yanked forward, nearly tearing the fabric. Stumbling into the hallway, Merrick slammed the door shut, bracing it with his shoulder. The wood groaned as the dead pressed against it. "We can't outrun them forever," Merrick gasped. Victor lifted the lantern. The flame flickered wildly, stretching upward like a thin blue blade. "They want something?" Victor whispered. "Not just revenge." The hallway shook again. The voices rose hundreds now, layered in panicked echoes. "Victor," Merrick said, struggling to stand straight. "What did your grandfather do here?" Victor swallowed hard. He never talked about it, only said the fire was an accident, that nobody could have survived. Another violent slam shook the door. Splinters flew. The soldier's arm thrust through the wooden panel, reaching blindly for them. "We need to move now," Merrick shouted. They stumbled toward the far end of the hall. The lantern hissed as frost crept across its glass. The flame grew thin, so faint sliver of light between them and total darkness. Ahead, an iron staircase spiraled downward. The morgue. Victor froze. "Merrick, that's where the bodies from the fire were taken." Another slam behind them. The soldier forced half its body through the broken door, shoulders cracking, bones bending with unnatural angles. Victor grabbed Merrick and half pulled him toward the staircase. If the grave opened by itself, then the answer is below. Merrick hesitated. "You think the dead are guiding us?" "No," Victor said, looking back at the soldier closing in. "I think they're hurting us." They descended. The lantern dimmed again, and Victor realized something horrifying. The flame wasn't dying. It was being smothered like. Something down there didn't want it to shine. Something waiting for them in the dark beneath Bonus. Scratches were the same crescent-shaped symbols I had seen on the grave Damoon's back-to-back, carved so violently the wood splintered upward like frozen tears. Cridge's hand rested inches from the final stroke, as if he had been trying to finish a message before something cut him short. The room smelled like damp stone and iron. The same suffocating mix I'd inhaled the night the grave opened. For a moment, I couldn't move. My breath stuck in my throat, and all I could do was listen to the creaking of the old house, to the slow drip of water somewhere behind the wall, and to something else, faint but unmistakable. A whisper. Not words, not fully a voice, but the shape of one. It hissed like breath drawn between teeth, rising and falling with the same rhythm Critch's chest no longer had. I forced myself closer. His other hand clutched something tightly. I bent, pried his fingers open slowly. They were stiff, but still warm, and found a small scrap of parchment. Older than anything in the archives. The edges were brittle, and on its center, drawn in ink so faded it was nearly dust, lay a name. Elias Vrana. The same name I had found in the cemetery records. The man buried beneath the moon-marked stone. The one the caretaker refused to acknowledge. The one whose grave had opened on its own, and beneath the name, written in what looked like blood. He wakes, when remembered. A chill sliced through me. I stumbled back from the table so fast my heel hit the uneven floorboard behind me. The whispering sound grew sharper, curling around the room like a creeping fog, weaving between the furniture, climbing the cracked walls. I looked toward the far corner, where the shadows were deepest. Something moved there quietly, subtly, as if retreating from the light leaking through the broken shutter. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of the house, nearly ripping my coat on the bent iron latch. The streets outside were empty, too empty for morning. No footsteps, no voices, just the cold stretch of cobblestones shimmering faintly with frost. I kept moving until the house was a shrinking outline behind me. But the memory of that whisper clung to me like a wet cloth. I needed answers. Real ones. Not symbols, not hints, not half-translated warnings. Something solid, which meant going back to the cemetery. The thought twisted my stomach, but nothing else made sense. If everything began with that grave, maybe everything could still be traced back to it. The streets narrowed as I wound through Old Town, past buildings older than memory. When I reached the cemetery gates, they were open. They had been locked last time. The caretaker was nowhere in sight. I stepped inside. The air had the same still, suspended quality as the night the grave opened, but the moon wasn't out. This was daylight. Pale and fragile, filtering through bare winter trees. I walked toward the old section where Elias Vrana's grave sat, or stood, or breathed. I no longer knew what word to use for something that behaved like a living thing. I froze halfway there. Another grave had shifted, not cracked open. Not fully disturbed, but the soil had sunk, forming a shallow depression, like something underneath had pulled away from the surface. The headstone leaned forward at a strange angle, as if bowing. It wasn't Elias's grave, it was the one beside it. A woman's, her name unreadable from erosion. I knelt, brushing dirt from the sunken patch. The soil was warm. Warm, graves don't warm, unless something beneath is alive. I flinched so hard I toppled back onto the cold path. For a second I thought I heard movement beneath the dirt, the faintest shift of weight, like someone turning over. In sleep. My heart pounded so violently the edges of my vision flickered. I didn't know whether to touch the ground again or run. Before I could decide, a voice croaked behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around to see the caretaker standing a few meters away. His eyes were red, his expression hollow. But what struck me most was his posture, like he had aged a decade overnight. He leaned on the gatepost, breathing hard, as though walking. To me had drained him. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. He shook his head. "It's begun," he whispered. "I told them not to move him. I told them not to disturb the moonstone. But they didn't listen. And now..." His gaze drifted to the sinking grave beside Elias's. "Now they answer him." "Oh," I managed. "The ones who died remembering him." He pointed to the depression in the soil. "That woman. She was buried with a diary. They say she wrote about him until her last breath. Those who remembered him in life, they awaken." First, I stared at the shifting dirt, bile rising in my throat. "What does he want?" I asked. The caretaker's face folded with fear so raw it barely looked human. "He wants what he lost," he said, "and he will gather every memory, every voice, every trace of himself until he is whole. He cannot rise alone." A sudden gust of wind tore through the cemetery, carrying with it a low, drawn-out groan from beneath the earth. The caretaker grabbed my arm. "Leave," he rasped, "before the sun sets. At dusk, the ground softens, and he listens." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "And whatever you found in that house, destroy it. The book, the parchment, all of it. You're tying yourself to him. He reases through remembrance." I shook my head. "I can't destroy it. It might be the only way to stop him." His expression turned to something colder than fear, resignation. "There is no stopping him," he said, "only Deline. And every person who remembers his name shortens the delay." Before I could answer, the soil beside the leaning grave cracked with a soft but unmistakable sound, like fingers pressing outward. The caretaker pushed me away. "Go!" But I didn't run, not yet, because the ground beneath the grave was beginning to move. The soil rose in a slow, deliberate swell, as if something underneath were stretching after a long sleep. The caretaker stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a crooked headstone, his breath rasping in short, panicked bursts. I should have run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out, to escape the rising shape pushing upward from the grave. But fear rooted me in place. Fear and a terrible, magnetic curiosity. The mound bulged once more, and this time the earth cracked. A seam split open in a jagged line, and loose dirt cascaded down the sides like sand through trembling fingers. Something pale glimmered beneath the soil. Not bone, not cloth. Skin. The caretaker lunged forward, grabbed my arm, and yanked me away from the grave. His voice broke as he shouted, "Don't look at it. Don't give it shape." But I had already seen enough to know what was happening. The woman buried there, whoever she had been, was answering the same call that had opened Elias Vrana's grave. She wasn't rising of her own will. She was being summoned. The wind shifted sharply, carrying the distinct smell of damp stone from the mausoleum deeper in the cemetery. It was the same smell that had filled Cridge's house. The same smell that clung to the parchment. I couldn't help looking back at the grave one more time. A hand dash and trembling broke the surface, fingers clawing for air that had been denied for decades. That was when the caretaker let out a low, wounded groan, like he had witnessed the end of something he had sworn to protect. "He's using them, all of them." The hand twitched unnaturally, bending backward at an impossible angle. It wasn't reaching for life, it was reaching for direction. Obedience. The ground shuddered again. "We have to go," I said, grabbing the caretaker's sleeve. No, he didn't argue. Together we backed away from the rising grave, moving between leaning stones and crooked markers until the swelling dirt fell out of sight. Only when we reached the outer path did the caretaker finally stop. His chest heaved. His eyes shone with something close to grief. "You still don't understand," he said quietly. "He doesn't need to rise. He only needs you to believe he can." I frowned, shaken. What is that supposed to mean? The caretaker hesitated, like the truth itself might harm us. Elias Rana was a scholar, a dangerous one. He believed memory could anchor a soul after death, that if enough people recalled a name, a face, a deed even, in fear those memories could stitch a spirit into the world again. So he fed on remembrance. "He still does," the caretaker whispered. "And when you read his name, when you touched that parchment, when you watched his grave open, you became part of him." The cold sank into my bones. But I didn't choose any of that. "Memory doesn't ask permission," he said, "and neither does he." A distant sound echoed across the cemetery, soft, rhythmic thuds, dirt collapsing, something crawling. Each thud sent a tremor through the frozen air. The caretaker flinched with every one. "They'll all rise by nightfall," he murmured. "Anyone who remembered him in life, anyone who wrote of him, spoke of him, whispered his name in fear. He's calling every echo." I swallowed hard. "Then we need to find a way to cut that connection. Break whatever's binding him." The caretaker gave a hollow laugh. "You think I haven't tried? I've burned journals, sealed graves, destroyed relics. But the past is stubborn. And memory is relentless." Another thud, louder this time. Then a second. Then a groan of shifting stone somewhere behind a row of mausoleums. "They're waking," he whispered. We hurried along the path, keeping to the edges of the cemetery. Every so often I glanced back, expecting to see another grave cracking open. But the strangest part wasn't what I said, was what I felt. Something pulling at me, lightly at first, like a thread tightening around my mind. A whisper brushing my thoughts. Not words yet, but intent. I quickened my pace. "We need to get out of here." "We can't leave," the caretaker said suddenly. I stopped. "What?" "If we leave now, they'll follow you," he said. "You're marked. Whether you like it or not." The cold deepened in my chest. Marked how? Through the parchment. Through the grave. Through him. The whisper inside my head sharpened. Not loud, not overwhelming, just there, like a breath behind my ear. I shook it off, but it clung. To me, like a persistent shadow. "Then tell me what I'm supposed to do," I demanded, because standing here waiting to be possessed or torn apart isn't a plan. The caretaker looked at me with a haunted weariness. There was a ritual, a counterbinding. His cultists wrote about it the way to sever a risen spirit from its anchors, but the pages were scattered, burned, lost. "Cridge," I said quietly. "He had pages?" The caretaker's eyes widened. "You saw them?" "He died trying to write something on his table. He had a fragment with Rana's name on it." For a moment, the caretaker stood perfectly still, then nodded slowly. "If he had a fragment, then the others still exist. You'll need to gather them." "Why me?" I asked. "Why not you? You know all of this better than I do." "Because he isn't tied to me," he said. "He's tied to you." A tremor ran through the ground. Another grave shifting. The caretaker grabbed my shoulder. "Find the fragments. All of them. Before nightfall. Before he completes himself." I stared at him. "Where?" His answer came as the wind shifted, carrying a distant noise, a door slamming, a dog barking, then silence. The caretaker's voice dropped to almost nothing. The archives. The oldest section. Beneath the museum. I felt the whisper in my head pulse at the word archive as if something had been waiting for me to hear it. Another grave cracked. Open in the distance. The caretaker pushed me toward the gate. Go now, before the dead decide they're not. Dawn rising. I didn't argue. I ran, the whisper following me all the way to the cemetery gate. As the ground behind me continued to move, I didn't stop running until the iron gate clanged shut behind me, its old hinges screaming like something alive. Even then, I didn't dare look back. The shifting earth, the cracking graves, the whisper curling at the base of my skull. Of it followed me like a second shadow. Only when I reached this street, where the faint hum of passing cars and the glow of distant lamps felt normal again, did I let myself slow. But normal wasn't returning. Not tonight. The caretaker's final words gnawed at me. The archives. Beneath the museum. Prague's National Museum loomed like a dark crown on a hill, its dome rising above the winter haze. I had passed it 100 times before, never thinking that anything beneath it could house something worse than the city's history. Now I wasn't so sure. As I made my way through the empty nighttime streets, the whisper in my mind shifted again. It was no longer just breath, had rhythm, pressure, a subtle push, like a fingertip guiding me toward a path I hadn't taken in years. It nudged me left when I meant to turn right. It slid thoughts into my head so softly I almost didn't notice they weren't mine. You're going the right way, it seemed to say. Keep walking. Come closer. I shook my head violently, muttering into the cold. You don't get to tell me anything. The whisper quieted but didn't disappear. The closer I got to the museum, the more the city changed. The street lamps flickered with an almost mechanical pulse, as if the electricity were breathing. A stray dog bolted across the road, whimpering at something I couldn't see, and every window I passed reflected my face, except for one. In a narrow antique shop window, my reflection wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, over my shoulder toward the darkness at the end of the street. I didn't turn around. The museum steps stretched ahead of me like a stone tongue, leading. 2 massive doors that were locked at night. But the caretaker hadn't expected me to walk through the front entrance. The archives he spoke of weren't part of the public museum. They belonged to the old network of tunnels abandoned, sealed, forgotten by most of Prague. I slipped around. To the side, where a rusted delivery gate sat half-hidden behind scaffolding. It was chained, but rusted through enough that one hard kick shattered the links. The metal groaned open. Inside, a narrow stairwell descended into pitch blackness. The cold rushing out of it smelled like paper rot and mold. And something else. Something faintly sweet, like old lilies left on a grave too long. I turned on my phone's light and stepped inside. The stairs spiraled deeper than I expected, the walls narrowing until my shoulders nearly brushed them. The whisper in my head throbbed with each step downward, aligning with my pulse. Once I swore I heard footsteps above me slow, dragging. Steps bet when I looked up, the stairwell was empty. At the bottom, a corridor stretched into darkness, lined with wooden doors labeled in peeling Czech, maps, genealogy, municipal records, private collections. But one door stood out. It had no label, no handle, and no hinges. Just a slab of blackened oak set into the wall like a coffin lid waiting to be pried open. My chest tightened. I didn't need the caretaker to tell me what was behind it. The whisper pressed harder, not violent, not screaming, just insistent, urgent. Here. My hands moved before my brain caught up. I pressed my palm against the wood. It was warm, too warm for a stone basement. Something shifted inside it, a latch, sliding of its own accord. Then, with a slow, sighing groan, the door opened inward, swallowing my light. Inside, rows of shelves stretched into the gloom, each one stacked with old parchment scrolls, bound manuscripts, and wooden boxers, stained by time. The air here was dense, heavy with centuries of unspoken stories. My light flickered over spines and labels, until it landed on the one symbol I dreaded, a circle bisected by a vertical line, carved into a stack of brittle pages. Rana's mark. The whisper in my head steadied, calm, waiting. I reached for the bait pages. Before my fingers touched them, something scraped across the floor at the far end of the room. A slow, dragging sound. I shone my light toward it, illuminating the outline of a human figure slumped at a desk, motionless, like a forgotten statue. Papers were scattered around him. His head hung forward at an unnatural angle. Critch, I whispered before. My mind caught the impossibility. The man at the desk didn't react. He wasn't. He cringed. This figure was too thin, too tall. I stepped closer, trying to angle my light toward the papers he had been writing. The whisper in my skull sharpened to a razor edge. Don't read it. I froze. Not because of the whisper. The figure at the desk moved. Not much. Just a tightening in the shoulders. A slow, unnatural lifting of the head. My breath locked in my throat. He had no eyes. Where the sockets should have been were only sunken dark pits, and yet I felt him stare straight at me. His jaw cracked open in a soundless gasp, and his hand long, stiff, almost wooden, reached toward me. I stumbled back, hitting a shelf. Scrolls rained down around my feet. The eyeless figure pushed up from the desk with agonizing slowness, each joint cracking as if awakening from decades of stillness. Then he spoke, not with a mouth, with a voice that blew through the shelves like a cold draft, rattling every page, every box, every forgotten name. You, Carrie. Him? The whisper in my head burst into a chorus. Not voices, but echoes. Pulling at my thoughts, tugging at my focus, urging me to take the scrolls, urging me to leave, urging me to kneel, urging me to run too many directions at once. Too many wills pressing in. The eyeless figure raised one shaking hand and pointed at the scrolls marked with Vrana's symbol. Then at me, then at the floor between us, where a thin line of dust had been disturbed by footsteps. Not mine. Something else had been here. Recently? Who took the other fragments? I whispered. The figure tilted its head, bones creaking. Finally, with a voice like grinding stone, it answered. He did. The whisper in my mind pulsed like a heartbeat. He knows. You're close. And then the lights went out. The graveyard went quiet in a way it never had before. Not the usual dead quiet. This was something deeper, heavier, like every tombstone was holding its breath. I felt the cold shift first, a pressure rolling through the air as if the night was bracing for something it already knew was coming. The lantern beside Colin Nicholson's grave flickered, then steadied. The soil at the base of the headstone trembled, not enough to be seen, only enough to crawl under the skin. A faint, rhythmic vibration pulsed upward. A heartbeat. Sergeant Morrow stiffened. Did you hear that? Before I could answer, it came. Again faint. Then clearer. A slow, dragging scrape from inside the coffin. My jaw tightened. No. That's not. Morrow held up a hand, eyes wide. Bodies don't move. not after decades, but something was moving. And now it had rhythm. 3 knocks, then silence, before either of us could breathe. The chapel door across the yard creaked open by itself. A slow, deliberate movement. Not wind, something else. Morrow's radio hissed alive with broken static. A distorted voice leaked through, layered like 2 mouths speaking at once. "Stop digging." Then the radio cut out. The lantern flame suddenly twisted upward like a white spiral, stretching toward the old mausoleum at the far end of the graveyard, the one sealed since 1873. Morrow swallowed hard. "We're not following that." But the flame rose higher, straining, pointing, urging. The ground at Cullen's headstone trembled again, stronger this time. A crack ripped through the soil. A voice rose from beneath the dirt. Weak, trembling. "Human, don't let it out." The mausoleum door groaned and slowly swung open. Stone scraping stone. The air grew colder, sharper. Something began crawling out. First a pale hand, then another. Long fingers dragging across the stone steps. The figure behind them stretched into the moonlight, tall, thin, spine arched unnaturally. Morrow backed up. What is that?" The thing tilted its head, its neck cracking in 3 slow pops. And then it smiled. A stretched, unnatural smile. The grave behind us exploded as Colin Nicholson's coffin burst open. Soil showered both of us as a hand shot out and grabbed my ankle. His voice rose through the dirt trough, terrified, begging, "Run." If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunted Graves After Dark for more stories that never rest.